Kevin Brooks with PK Solutions in the Farmland Ownership series. We've had our first set of questions asked to the class, and I'm going to make an attempt here to answer those. Please feel free to keep these coming. I will typically answer the questions, but I may leave a little bit out or address them again when we get to that segment of the lessons. But again, keep the questions coming. The first one, from the perspective of an investor, where is the best place to buy land in the United States? In other words, what parts of the country maximize long-term returns via income and appreciation? Income coming from rent, and then appreciation coming from increased values. The answer I'm going to give here and now, and I think it'll become even more clear once we get further into the lessons, I'm dividing it into several parts. We'll first cover short-term investing and then long-term investing. The answer depends somewhat on whether one is borrowing for the purchase or using cash. When using cash, I believe land is solid about anywhere in the U.S. as an investment, unless you're paying amounts outrageously higher than what similar land is selling for. Buying land through debt is a different story, however. Then it will depend on the percentage down payment and the interest rate. For sure, I would stay away from adjustable rate loans. We are still in volatile times. If the economy does start to improve by solid standards, and we really haven't seen this yet, regardless of what you see on the news, you can expect interest rates to rise, which is problematic for adjustable rate loans. I'm not convinced yet that investing in land for development, or land that you think might be developed someday, will have much of a return for quite some time, depending upon the location. We still haven't seen the dramatic rises in land value as a percentage basis that we saw back in the 1970s, prior to the pop of the land bubble in the 1980s. When the U.S. was beginning to feed the world after World War I, which was a long time ago, but basically going back in history, we've seen two times where land values have decreased dramatically in the last 100 years. But after World War I, the U.S. was beginning to feed the world. The bubble burst as other economies became back online. And then the Great Depression caused land values to slide even further. So it took on the order of 12 years from the high to reach the lows, the high being in the early 1920s, 1920, and reaching the lows around 1932, 1933, at the depths of the Great Depression. But it took another 20 years until the early 1950s to retrace the values of what they were back in 1920. That's over 30 years. So if you would have bought land at the high, again, depending on the land, how much you paid for it and how much you borrowed for it, it might not have been a good investment for some people. The other time occurred, and we had the rapid rise back in the 70s, and the bubble popped in the early 1980s. In, I think it was 1981, land values began to slide, and it slid for 6 years before it reached the bottom, and it took another 12 years to retrace those values. So from high to high, it was 20 years, not like the, it was 18 years, not like the 30 years in the Great Depression time, but 18 years is a long time depending on when you bought the land. And you may wonder now, if we're currently in a land bubble, it's difficult to determine. I can tell you that the increase in land values are brought on primarily by a combination of ethanol mandates. In other words, the government's mandating a certain amount be used, but those max out in 2015, and actually we've seen a maxing out of ethanol now as grain prices just get so high. There's not a lot of incentive there without government subsidies to use corn ethanol. Corn for as the base for ethanol. If interest rates don't rise, that is a sign that we're in economic trouble, and that's going to be both good and bad for farmers. Good in that people will be investing in commodities. Bad that the economy is not doing well and demand may be down. We're seeing lowering use of gasoline. Some of that is brought on by the economy and the fact that we've had a generation of children that have grown up watching movies like Happy Feet. I guess where I'm going with this is they're much more environmentally sensitive, and this new generation of young adults just doesn't drive as much. So we're looking at some demographic shift as well. But I would come back with the question, it depends on how much you're going to be borrowing. And then the other question is, where else are you going to put your money in that has that kind of safety? If you look at the stock market back in the early 2000s, we're basically at the same levels now as what we were then, and we went down in between. Is there a safe place for money? Some people believe gold, and there are also people who believe that gold is going to come crashing down. As far as the big investors, a lot of them are looking internationally. There's a lot of development going on in Africa. As commodity prices are high, there's incentive to develop lands. Also Eastern Europe. Ukraine has some of the best farm ground in the world. It's never been fully developed in that they don't have the infrastructure in place, and they don't have the credit market in place as well. But there's a lot of potential there. In the United States, though, specifically, the big investors are paying a lot of attention in the Delta region of the Mississippi River, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana. Some very good farm ground there, and it hasn't had the pressure on the upside as much as what we've seen in what is called the three I states, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. And a lot of the big investors are staying away from that. It was for a while that a lot of the investors looked to Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana for a while, but lately most of the increase in value is coming from farmers with cash in hand. They can be doing it by having the cash, because farmers are making a lot of money right now, and somewhat at the expense of landowners. And they're also, for those who are older and more established, but also have had good years of cash flow and profits, they're spreading the loans out over multiple pieces of land. So it's there's some stiff competition there coming from farmers themselves in the three I states, not so much from outside investors. Next question, should an investor be concerned about buying farmland right now? Are we in a bubble? And that gets back to what I mentioned earlier about the 2 times where land values did go down and how long it took to recover that. So the short answer is, yeah, you should be terrified if you're investing land as your main source of investment and you're borrowing a lot of money. Borrowing a lot of money probably is not a good idea right now, especially if you're borrowing on variable interest rate loans. And again, that gets back to what caused a lot of problems in the 80s, as interest rates rose, and it really caused cash flow problems for farmers. It'd be the same thing with landowners. So I guess I would recommend to protect yourself, put a large down payment down, make sure you're getting an adequate return, and make sure you lock in an interest rate that is affordable. Okay, next question. What is a reasonable rate of return going forward on an annualized basis? From 2 perspectives of farm rent income and also from an appreciation income. First of all, I would like to say that with farming, you've got to treat it like a business and ignore the appreciation part of it. That's all good. Historically, it's going to be there in the long term. Some of it gets into how old the investor is and whether it's for yourself, for your children, your children's children. A lot of those things go into the equation. But you need to look at it as a business. So what I would concentrate on would be the rent income and whether that's going to pay for things. And historically speaking, the rent income, the rental income needs to be above the cost of the borrowing costs and opportunity costs. If you would put the money in a CD or another investment, you need to be able to recover that. But long term, we have not seen returns in ag that are tremendously above that. Right now, we have been, if you're adequately charging for cash rent, or you're in a crop share agreement. 1,000 acre farmers, I mean, are taking home $300,000-$400,000, even more, the past several years. That's a lot of money, and it should be split between the owner and landowner, but cash rents haven't yet caught up, as a lot of landowners don't understand, or the farmer makes a good pitch for reasons as to not pay those. I'm not here to take the sides of the landowner or the farmer, but when you're buying land, you are the owner, and you should expect a reasonable return on that. Historically, it's been 3.5 to the cash rent has been 3.5 to 5% of the farmland value, occasionally a little bit higher. Right now, with the major increase in land values, cash rents are not keeping up. And if you have a $10,000 an acre piece of ground and you're getting 3.5% interest on it, that's $350 cash rent. And in a lot of areas, there's a lot of resistance to paying that. If you're looking at the $14,000 an acre ground, and you want 4%, you can see how interest rates could easily approach $600 or even more to be able to achieve that, and they're just typically not there yet. Nor is it easy finding a lot of local farmers who are willing to pay that. So you have to look at that, but generally speaking, historically about 3.5% on rental income. And on the long term, there's just ups and downs, which I talked about, but somewhat above the cost of money. All told, you're probably shooting for 7 to 8%, but there's risks in that. Some years it's going to be, some periods of time it's going to be lower, and right now we're looking at times that are much higher than that. And regardless of what anybody tells you, there is absolutely no way to know what the future is and whether that is going to continue or not. We're just looking at artificial interest rates being way too low, artificially too low. We're looking at commodity prices, the grain prices being driven in part by ethanol, which could come, or it could stay, it could increase, it could go. There's just a lot of variables there, and a lot of those variables have to do with government policy and also human events. We go back to the 1980s, and what triggered some of that was that rising interest rates as we had the stagnating economy in the 70s. We had gone completely off the gold standard under Nixon, and we were still trying to adjust for that. Interest rates, as you might remember, went upwards of 20%. But we also had the Soviets in the 70s were starting to import some of our grain to feed their livestock, and then when they invaded Afghanistan, the Olympics weren't the only thing that was boycotted. We had the grain embargo. No grain from the U.S. being shipped to the Soviet Union, and it hit farmers really hard. Question number 4. What characteristics should investment property have? A couple of things here. The property has to have value for somebody else, and I would look for farms that have good records on yields, tile location, history, consistent productivity, a good location, and adequate size. If you want bids from larger farmers, and larger farmers are typically the ones that are bidding ground up higher on cash rent, it's going to be something that they want. It has to be adequate size. And the follow-up question to that, what is a reasonable size of tract? For local farmers, 40 acres. I mean, they'll go lower than that. For bigger farmers, they like to see 80s, 60s, 80s, or higher. If it's lower than that in the amount of acres, a piece of land that is has flat lines, neat, square, rectangular, as opposed to angles. They could get big equipment up and down, or up and down the field, not up and down the hills, which was, generally speaking, hills probably aren't a good idea if you're wanting maximum rent out of it. So that takes us through questions 4 and 5. 6. 7. What are some financing sources from which to purchase land? Some sources for financing include relatives. I think that's one that's untapped. That have the cash, or self-directed IRAs to which they could invest in land. A borrower or a lender right now that I'm really high on, and I get nothing out of it, is Farm Credit Services. There are others, but they've really taken a conservative approach. They really got beat up back in the 1980s with the farm crisis, and there are enough people still around that don't want to go through that again. And with Farm Credit Services, they put a cap right now, I think it's $6,000 on prime ground, the maximum. You have to have 35% down minimum, but the maximum they'll loan you is $6,000 on prime ground, which is about in the 130 productivity index range, which we'll go over later, up into the 140s. The good land is 5,000, which is about 117 up to 130 on the productivity index using the Bulletin 811, and below 117, about $3,700 is the max that they're going to loan. There are banks out there that will do it. There's a lot of competition out there. A lot of people who don't remember the 1980s are now involved. You can get below 5% on interest rates that are fixed rates from some local banks. But again, the reason why I'm kind of high on farm credit right now is that having been an ag loan officer back in the 1980s, I can tell you that it really got ugly, and I like their policies in terms of if you're going to use credit, protecting it. We saw what happened with the housing industry, and the same thing can happen. If you're borrowing at 35% and we have a decrease of 50%, you're not going to get hit as hard. And especially if you have a fixed interest rate in there. I know you can get lower on adjustable, but I would want to lock that down in terms of the interest rate. Okay, if you have any questions, call me, 217-586-3894, or email me, kwbrooks@bksolutionsonline.com. Early next week, we'll look at the first lesson, where we'll be looking at farmland values and doing some estimates. And like I said, if you have any questions, please give me a call or an email. Until then, have a nice weekend.